You're listening to the Physio Matters podcast in association with Choose Health, and this is session 37. Welcome back to the Physio Matters podcast. I'm Jack Chew, and today we'll be chatting to my team, the Physio Matters podcast team, of course, and which includes some crossover from the clinical team of Choose Health, and the key players, as per usual: Mark Reid, our clinical lead, what we consider our lead researcher, the brains that is Rob Tyer, rheumatology lead Jack March, and co-founder Charlotte Rattenbury. We also have a latest team member. Like, this is literally a new signing. A friend of mine, Felicity Thow, is back from New Zealand. You'll hear her at the end of the podcast. Unfortunately, she couldn't make it in time for the group chat over Skype, so we chatted the next morning. She brought some incredible insight to the conversation around the NHS that we had for this podcast. Massively interesting. I hope it's not just us that think so. Hugely pertinent issue politically and socially at the moment in the UK, and our international listeners, I'm sure, can reflect on how similar the issues might be in and around your country. And also how relevant it is for when the NHS is held up as a model for, quite rightly, as a model that should be used as a blueprint for socialised health service. We're all a group of as a group. Yes, we're a group, but also a set of individuals with our own opinions and takes on these matters. There's an awful lot of overlap. We talk about these things often, and we tend to share similar views on them. But you'll recognise that our stories differ and influences in different ways. We've got discussions around locum services, people that have worked abroad, people working in different sectors, people working as contractors within the health service for private companies. And I try and invigilate the job lot. A quick nod towards last month's episode, which has gone down a storm, unsurprisingly, really, because Anina Schmid is a fantastic example of applied practice. Some really valuable critique come through from that episode as well. Not just people saying thank you, but also people saying applying to what I appealed for at the end of the episode, suggesting that it might be valuable to hear more about specific application of how that leads to differences in treatment. And I recognise that that's a bit of a blind spot of mine. I do find myself piecing those things together and not articulating them, and maybe not getting the guests to explain just how that translates to variations of treatment, what the do's and do nots are, and perhaps applying it to specific case studies. A lesson I will learn. It came up in our Ask Me Anything podcast that I did for our patrons, which was in December. Really enjoyed doing that. It certainly won't be the last one I do, so jump over onto Patreon. You qualify for our exclusive content at only a couple of dollars a month. Also, you enter our prize draw. If you enter and join for $15 a month, you enter into a prize draw for courses. We're pretty much drawing every other month. Last year for courses in the UK, and we also had people coming from abroad to these courses that were hundreds of pounds usually, that go out for free to our patrons. So certainly well worth joining, and we've not had any unhappy customers just yet, so certainly join us on there, and you'll hear lots of exclusive content from us, as well as the Physio Natters, which has gone from strength to strength. I think that's on its 9th episode. Jack March and Rob Tyer's little pet project to try and keep us versatile and adaptable in an ever-changing world where we try and keep his finger on the pulse. They just did an episode with Hannah Enser on hypermobility, which is just a fantastic conversation, getting a patient's perspective. And Hannah's a big advocate for people with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, as well as other conditions. She considers her and her own to be the bendies, and so it was great to hear her chatting to Jack March, who also has some specialist insight into those conditions. So well worth checking that out on our Facebook page. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at TPM Podcast, and I'm at choose_health. Follow the team. From there, I'll make sure that their individual Twitter feeds and stuff are all on the written work that comes with this podcast. So, without further ado, we want to try and get to the NHS issues. I don't find myself wading in too much, I hope, apart from bending the questions and offering my follow-ups on this conversation. But just to plant my flag straight away, and I don't ever pretend to be without bias. I think it's ridiculous to suggest so. Be no surprise to most of you that I'm passionate about health and passionate about education. That's what brings me to the podcast and to various things that I do, both in and out of business. And in doing so, I'm hugely worried about some of the things that are going on within the NHS, hugely politically pertinent at the moment. But I find that conversations become so polarised because of political affiliations, amongst other things, or hugely passionate and emotional language that can sometimes get dragged into this debate, and rightly so sometimes. But the way in which people's compassion for the group rather than the individual can sometimes make us all a bit clouded. Very difficult to be individualistic on these discussions without it seeming selfish. And so it gets rather muddled. Personally, therefore, I find myself frustrated at the lack of discussion that can go on between or understanding. Like anyone that works in I'm yet to find anyone in the NHS that isn't able to point to a whole host of things that are incredibly frustrating within it and hugely inefficient. And I remember tweeting years ago now, tweeting that I went into work on a contract that I had, in which I was greeted by the perfect NHS metaphor. It was the height of summer, the windows were open and the heating was on full blast. And it's something that I remember resonating with my Twitter followers at the time. It certainly didn't make me any friends that weren't already following when it spread wider. But generally speaking, I found that is a frustration that I have. But then I am not someone that feels that this is something that is so broken, therefore it needs radical reform and the introduction of full free market economics to privatise the system in its fullest. And that is something that does concern me. I'm someone that, working also within the private health system, I'm hugely concerned about the ways in which profit can dominate it can overhaul the caring nature that we hope would run throughout the middle of any conversation between a professional and a patient. It can really cloud people. Even with the best of intentions, it can cloud systems, institutions and policies. And that really worries me. And so the conversation needs to be thorough and deep. It needs to discuss not just the system, but the society in which the system serves. It needs to talk about us as professionals. It needs to talk about the patients that we serve. And also, above all else, conversation needs to be flowing. And anything that shuts that down, be it people pointing fingers and playing a blame game, is no good, but also anyone playing a particularly specific victim narrative for the sake of political gain, that gets you no points from me either. So that's where this conversation gets directed. We try and think of the pros and cons and try and come up with our hopes as well as our fears of the NHS for the future. So I hope you enjoy it. I bring you Team Physio Matters. Okay, so we're here with the Physio Matters team for our third annual, I think it is, team podcast, and we will be joined later by our newest team member, Felicity Thow. But in the meantime, I've got Jack March, Rob Tyer, Mark Reid, Charlotte Rattenbury. We're going to go through our thoughts on the NHS, a few questions directed at each one relevant to their roles and responsibilities that they've had either currently or in the past. And we'll invite everyone to chip in and pipe up with questions that aren't directed at them if they feel they've got something to add, or even if they don't feel they've anything useful to add, then Mark, you can join in as well. Starting off with, though, we'll go to Mr. March. You and Shah are the most highly specialised in our team, since most of us are MSK generalists. Does the NHS utilise your skill set for the betterment of your community as it should?
I think it's a difficult question, really. So when I was thinking about answering that particular question, I thought about it in some different ways. So I think the role that I just left in the NHS, so I don't work in the NHS anymore as of about 2 weeks ago, I think worked relatively well for patients, but at times isolated myself and my department from the rest of the outpatients departments. And I think if you ask some of the colleagues, they might feel in a similar way. So if you take the answer purely from, as you said, just from the patient's point of view, I think actually it worked quite well, because most of my caseload, if not all, was purely rheumatology. But one of the problems I think that started to occur, especially when I was about to leave, is that it seems like my department was shielding the rest of sort of the musculoskeletal department from those rheumatology patients. So when I was there going to leave, and there were, I'm not going to say emergency, that's not quite the right term, but more urgent patients that needed seeing, they didn't have any knowledge really of those more complex conditions and their management, which made life a little bit difficult. And I'm not sure that was the best thing then for the patients. So I think while it was all running and nice and going fine, everything was sort of sunny and hunky-dory. But then as soon as everything started to unwind a little bit, things started to break down. So I wonder whether that slight isolation in the long run wasn't therefore helpful. Brilliant for me in my progress and development as a physio doing something specialist in rheumatology. But for the other physios, they're in a little bit more of a difficult position now than they might well have been had we been a bit more sharing.
So if there's it sounds like you're describing a bit of a failure of succession planning, and is that because of a lack of in-reach from you, or a lack of openness to said in-reach?
I think probably a combination. So obviously when we're talking about outpatient caseloads, we're all very busy, which, while not an excuse, does make time a little bit more limited. So it's difficult to spend time talking about what are relatively rare conditions and very complex conditions when we have caseloads of very common conditions that are with long waiting lists. So then maybe not necessarily seen as a priority, but then as soon as they become that priority because the person with the skill set has left or is not going to be there anymore, then things start to break down that little bit. So I did in-service trainings, and I went and I tried as much as possible to go to the in-service trainings run by musculoskeletal so that we were in the same environment as much as possible. And over time, I was able to be in the musculoskeletal department at times, but most of the time, people are doing their own caseload. So it's very difficult to get that spread of knowledge around.
So what could the actual system then, or the wider organisation of the NHS or the trust that you worked in, how could they have solved that problem?
So I think that really what should happen is, it is really difficult because of the complex nature of patients, but if you could have a system where everybody, let's say everybody worked in musculoskeletal, so I'm sort of, you don't divide off the specialties, but you might have your certain specialties. So for example, maybe if you've got a few people in that musculoskeletal department, I would specialize in rheumatology. We'd have someone who specialized in upper limb, for example, someone in lower limb, someone in spinal, but you all share to a degree a caseload, which would take some serious triaging and spreading of caseloads, but you could have that way of doing it. So let's say you get a rheumatology patient referred in, and if I was to do all the rheumatology triaging, for example, then what could happen is that to those other three people that I mentioned, they could have a few of the slightly simpler versions of that patient, and then the same happens with the spinal. So they might send some of the simpler spinal patients over to me, and upper limb and lower, and sort of cross-reference it a little bit like that. That would become more and more difficult with a larger department, but I think would possibly be doable. Mm-hmm. And then what you can then have is those inter sort of discussions where they might have this rheumatology patient they're struggling with, and then they can come and have peer supervision or a peer discussion with me about that, and the same with me with an upper limb or a spinal injury or whatever it is. And then you get that bit of spread of knowledge around. Whereas I think the segregating, even down to segregating off the women's health and to a degree pediatrics, although women's health and pediatrics are a bit more difficult to bring into the fold. But I think that might be a way of sorting that sort of isolation out a little bit.
So we're talking about the NHS on both a clinical level, which you've done, and then on an operations level, which you're bringing in. But what's stopping that happening then that you encountered?
A lot of it's time. A lot of it is time, and the perceived lack of time, and the pressure of the waiting list. So we all know that as the waiting lists go up, and they creep towards that magic 18-week deadline level, that what happens is that people above you start to get antsy, and we have to think around ways of bringing those waiting lists down.
Yeah. But
that doesn't then necessarily help the quality of things moving forward. So you might put into place something. So let's take for a personal example, our GP physios were struggling with their waiting lists. I took on some of their new patients. In the short term, their waiting list comes down, but I don't know in the long term whether that makes any difference to quality in any way. Right. So I think that longer term views, like you say, need to be taken. So you might have to sacrifice waiting lists, or you've got, I assume really you've got a choice. You either sacrifice quality or you sacrifice the waiting list length. So if in the short term you went, right, what we'll do, we're going to allow the waiting lists to creep up, but we're going to bring quality in and improve these things. Once the quality is there, then we'll work to bring the waiting list down within that same quality. I don't think what you can do is we're going to raise the quality and decrease the waiting list and do it on a smaller budget, because it's just not viable.
I think we'll probably come to this with someone else, and I'd drag you back into it, but trying to get quality across a variety of clinicians that have their own autonomy, it's just something we've talked about before, becomes complicated. So we'll touch back on that. But another question I had for you is that if you were to hold up an example of the NHS at its best, what would it be?
Again, a difficult one to answer, but I think I came around to the answer of probably, and this would be a weird one, but orthopedics. So for a patient flow, that's how I see things working quite nicely. So you have a problem, you go and see X, Y, and Z, you end up in having orthopedic surgery. There's a relatively fixed rehab program, and then you go out the door the other side. So while we might not agree on the candidates for surgery, we might not agree on the type of surgery and all those kind of things, there is an obvious flow from every department I've ever worked in where patients go and everybody in the team seems to know what happens next. So if you walked onto an orthopedics ward, I bet that you could ask any member of the MDT and they would be able to roughly tell you what the physios are going to do at what point and when the patient goes home. So that, from my eyes, is one of the better routes of working. Now, obviously, especially elective orthopedics becomes much simpler. The patients tend to be a bit more well, all those kind of things. But if you could get that working into most of the other departments, so everybody in the MDT knew what the other bits of the MDT were doing and when and how and all those sorts of things, I think that could make the flow a lot better. But again, that takes working with the other members of the MDT and knowing what they're doing. And again, that takes time. And I think that's something that we're lacking for various reasons.
Do you not think that's what they've tried to do across the board, though? Because it works well in those circumstances because there's a lack of ambiguity of diagnosis, at least a perceived one with the orthopods and the orthopedic services. So everyone's clear because everything's simpler. And these are otherwise relatively well patients that have just had a knee replacement, so they can be put onto a conveyor belt with fewer complications. So is it not that people have tried to extrapolate that model and most of the time it's more complicated than that?
But I don't know if complexity should reduce your ability to do that. So let's say if you took a patient with a heart problem, for example, they might be a lot less well, and they might they might go from ITU to the cardiac ward to a rehab ward, for example. They might be much more unwell, but I can't see how roughly they're going to still have this, each person's still going to roughly have the same flow. And you might get some different, they might come in from a different residential status or something like that, but even so, the groundwork should still be there. But admittedly, a long time since I did that kind of work, but I don't see that same thing happens. You get this confusion where you get this, oh, the patient's medically well, but they're not able to walk as far as they are able to. Why is that? Or the physios are happy, but then the doctors aren't. And you get this confusion, and people they're not quite on the same page. And that's where you get those discharge errors.
Yeah, so care's not quite as integrated. And you feel, when we're talking about the NHS as a whole entity, do you feel that is an overcomplexity of sometimes relatively, although complex humans, complex problems, but an overcomplexity of the system on as a whole, or the conveyor belt as we're describing starts to fall apart?
Yeah, and it's sometimes it's not even the individual. So if you, let's say it's not an individual ward's fault, so they might have this really nice plan, but if you've got things with bed pressures or you've got that kind of stuff, and people are being moved, that adds unnecessary complication.
Cool. And so you admitted there that you recently left the NHS, having worked there since you started, although of course with working with us, and I know you've been working at Preston's Health as well, so you've been dabbling with some private work as well. But what's then taking you out of the NHS then? How is the NHS managing to lose someone of your skill set?
Well, in all honesty, a lot of it is to do with my personal circumstances, but equally, I feel like I got a bit jammed into my post. There weren't possibilities for me to move up through the banding scales where I work. I mean, I live in Norfolk. I'm in the back end of nowhere, so it's not like if I was in Birmingham or London or something and there was another hospital around the corner, there might be opportunities to move to a different department and move and progress. But I felt like I was stuck, and I'm you're waiting for someone to leave so they vacate a post. And if they're not going to go, where are you going to go?
Yeah, so dead man's boots.
Yeah. So, while I'm not saying I was definitely ready to move to a higher position or did have the skill sets or whatever it is, but the opportunities don't exist. And I get very frustrated when I can't see a moving forwards target. So I can have my targets for myself, so I can go, right, well, I'm going to do my CPD around this and do this and improve clinically like this. But if I don't have that target where I can go, right, I'm aiming to achieve that thing, then I start to struggle, which is one of the reasons why I ended up going to work with Helen Preston at Preston's Health, because that was an entirely new challenge, working privately outside of the NHS. And I was quite a lot happier when I did that, because it gave me something else to focus on.
Fair enough. No, that makes sense. Now, we'll probably come back to those things about motivation and making sure that we tap into what that means operationally for how to really get the right people in the right positions. Rob, if we can come to you, you work for a private company who bid for business under the Any Qualified Provider initiative. To many, privatisation is...
Who's booing?
Who's booing?
Did Rob just boo himself?
No, that was me.
No, I think who wasn't booing? Because privatisation is admittedly a dirty word, but to me it seems a bit of a misleading term when services do remain free at the point of access. So what do you feel are the main pros and cons to the current system?
So, I mean, I can only, as Jack March said, he's worked in the same sort of environment for quite some time. I've only really worked for Connect. I did 6 months in the NHS on rotations covering maternity leave. That contract ended. This one came up, and this is where I've been ever since. So I can only really speak in terms of what we do. There's a couple of things that I wanted to sort of allude to on the pros side of things, because I think quite possibly if we look back at session 17 with yourself and #IPOPs, there wasn't really much positivity. And
Sure.
I think it was a bit unfair. And I know we've had our discussions off the mic about that.
Yeah.
But some of the things that I think are really positive is there is, I think I'm making a word up here, but departmentalization. So lots and lots of different
That's a good one.
cogs. I know. So I thought it made me sound quite clever.
Almost makes sense, that, man.
Yeah.
Almost. So we've got lots and lots of little pods around the head office where each group of individuals has their own job. So you've got your clinical staff, you've got your admin staff, you've got your HR staff, you've got your contract staff, and I think that's what makes it work really well, is that everyone's got a clearly defined role,
Right.
and it takes the admin away from physio. Well, not completely. There's always going to be admin, but it takes the bulk of it away. I mean, I don't want to mention where, but when I did my placements a few years back, I was working in an environment where it wasn't in the northeast, but they had the same sort of footfall per year, MSK wise, as we do where I am currently, and they had three secretaries or three sort of admin staff, and one of them was part time, I believe, to cover about 77,000 people per year.
Right.
And we have at least 7 to 9. So just admin staff who are processing, who are booking appointments, who are contacting DNA patients, who are rebooking appointments when a patient rings up and said, I can't come tomorrow, can you make it next week? And that is a massive, massive burden taken off your shoulders. I mean, I would go into the room on placement and see these sort of highly paid band 8s, band 7s who are triaging information, who are sort of organising appointments and things like that. And I thought, for me, that was, I mean, obviously they have to do the triage side of things, but it was just a really inefficient way of utilising time, would be my opinion on that. So we've got a department that purely looks after that. We've also, because we've got this sort of departmentalisation, to shoehorn that word in again, we've also got this great computer system that allows each of the departments to communicate. So we collect data on everything. And I know when we listened back to some of the podcasts that Adam Meekins did, I think it was Steve Tolan, who was talking about there's drawers and drawers of outcome data all over the country just not being used. Whereas ours is all electronic and it's all shared centrally. And as a result, we've got reams of data which have allowed us to sort of take massive leaps forward in the last few years in terms of how we run things.
Sure.
So we're starting to publish information now as well. So I think that's a big pro. So although we're a bit behind the times compared to the NHS in terms of how long we've been around, we're certainly forward thinking in that respect, that we're collecting data and we're starting to utilise it to sort of problem solve.
Right.
So one big thing to come out of the thing that the privatisation side of things is we were able to be put in this unique opportunity to run a pilot study. So there was a small area around the northeast that was having some trouble getting patients into physiotherapy. And as a result, the waiting lists were creeping up to sort of 12 weeks on average.
Mm.
So the GP would make the decision to go, well, this person needs to see a physio, can't get them in to see a physio, I'll just send them to an orthopaedic surgeon.
Yeah.
And they would get to see an orthopaedic surgeon much sooner than the physio. The orthopaedic surgeon would see them and go, I don't know what you're doing here, you need physio, I'm going to refer you back to physio. So 70% of the people who turned up to an orthopaedic surgeon's front door didn't end up having surgery and just required physio.
Yeah.
So there was a pilot study put in place, and that was a year's pilot study that started, I think it was 1st January 2011, and we're still running it. So we're still going, even though it was only a year. And as a result, we've found that we reduced the expenditure across this area by £84,000. I think it was £1.09 per head of the population in the area. It was 77,000. We reduced the secondary care referrals by 64%. So all those people who were inappropriately going to see these orthopaedic surgeons, neurologists, whatnot, they were going through the physio service or the IMAT CAT service, and as a result, not going to the wrong place. So kind of like this conveyor belt that Jack was talking about before, getting them into sort of a more appropriate method of care, kind of like what you were talking to Paula about on session 17 in terms of better triage, patients going to see the right person at the right time, that kind of thing. And it was all based on that MSK framework that was published in 2006.
Sure.
So that's the big pro is we managed to, well, okay, give us a chance to prove ourselves, and we did it, and we published data based on that, and as a result we retained the contract, and we kept going.
If you were to scrutinise that data as much as you would anything, because I know you and I know how heavy you can delve into your statistics, is that the equivalent of a poor control group as a comparator? Because it was so inefficient from the off. I mean, it's ticking all the classic boxes of an inefficiency, where it's backed up so far that it has to then go to the old school top-down model of orthopedics first, and then trickle down into physio. So that was always going to be incredibly costly. So any cost benefit, which you're describing, which is brilliant, is always going to be exaggerated. Yeah,
of course it is. But as with any study, as I said at the start, it was a pilot study. So as with any study, you have to run it first to see whether it's a viable method. So then if you've got this sort of model of care now that you can roll out, and it's demonstrated large cost savings, yes, I wouldn't say previously poor function and service, because it would be unfair for me to make an assumption on why it was taking 12 weeks to get people in to see physio. But if we've got that sort of baseline level of information, go, right, well, why don't we roll it out to another area where we're currently got a 6-week wait on physio, or a 4-week wait, or a 3-week wait, or whatever you want to do, and say, well, how does that run alongside a matched pair? Or you can actually implement that into the area. Okay. It's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it's evidence that we're doing something that is contributing to the profession.
Yeah.
And I
absolutely.
think that, to come onto the cons of working for the private sector, is that you're tarred with the same brush of poor quality providers, poor people who are providing or not providing any information at all, who inevitably lose the contract, and then therefore all private providers have been given this bad name of, well, don't go to them, it's private, it's dirty.
And that's why it gets typically booed, and we said it ends up being a dirty word. So what should you be doing to combat that then? So if we think about, how could Connect stop themselves getting tarred with that brush, or lumped in with the bad eggs?
It's difficult, because I don't think there is one answer. Certainly one thing we're doing is we're putting in place some great clinicians into different areas of where we work. And some of them are a bit more social media savvy now, so they're getting on board. The likes of Matt Wyatt down London, and just starting to do the stuff that people actually want to see. Because one of the discussions I've had is that you don't need to be banging the drum about your brand as such. You don't need to be going, look at us, this is what we're doing. You can just put yourself out there and go, we're around, we're doing this kind of work, but that's not necessarily what defines us. Here's some information about good practice, and just basically becoming more visible and inviting people to have that discussion. Because I think that's the problem, is that you're only ever going to hear, not only ever, that's probably a bit too harsh, but most of the time you're going to hear bad reports, and oftentimes it's going to be from people who've left.
Sure. Yeah, and one of the things with Physio Matters, as you guys all know, is that we managed to carve out at least a degree of credibility by the fact that we open and honestly will critique ourselves first and foremost, and we will be, if we're calling out other professions or other what we consider poor practice, then we will be looking to ourselves, looking at and accepting the difficulties that we all face. Now, do you think that for me, that's a frustration that I have with the people or companies feeling sorry for themselves that they get lumped in or tarred, is that I hear praise silence on the fact that they're not there calling out the people that are making them look bad. They're not necessarily being the ones to. It's this natural all for one and one for all silence when it comes to making sure you don't badmouth or slander. And I'm not trying to say that it should be badmouthing and slandering in any malicious sense, but it's just that how can we as clinicians look on and sort of feel sorry for it when they're not necessarily making it clear as to what differentiates?
You could say the same about the NHS though, Jack, because there are a lot of systems out there that are failing. And I think the most recent one was the, which part of Essex was it? whether we're going to decommission physio altogether mid-Essex or something.
Yeah.
Mid-Essex.
Yeah, and you've got these people on social media who are going, "Oh, well, we need physio, we need physio." It's a terrible, terrible shame that they're decommissioning physio. And yeah, I agree it is. But what they weren't saying was, well, why did it get to that stage in the first place?
Sure, well, you're preaching to the converted though here. We certainly will question the NHS. I've said before that my issue being that there's an awful lot of complacency within the health service, but there's an awful lot of profiteering that can go on outside of it, and it's about trying to mitigate both of those sides. And so it was a bit of whataboutery, isn't it, to say, yeah, but the NHS is the same. Whilst I agree, it's not good on either front, is it?
No, it's not. It's not, and it's a very difficult thing to do because you've got to tread carefully. Because if we take a step back and look at the bigger picture, and you are an enterprise, let's say Choose Health decided that they wanted to tender for a certain contract, but Choose Health is seen to be someone who is more publicly known for calling out other providers rather than delivering good quality outcomes, delivering data, presenting information. Then as a CCG, you're probably going to steer away from that provider. And I think you've got to box clever. I think it's got to be about, well, not necessarily bad mouthing, but let's show what we can do by comparison. So
yeah, you've got to do. But I accept you've got to do both. But enough silence becomes sort of it's a sense of propaganda, isn't it? It's just that there's we don't like what they're doing, but someone else can deal with it. It's not our responsibility to deal with it. It's not our responsibility to sort of clean up our own side of the. I mean, we could end up doing a full podcast on this, Rob, and one day maybe we will. But let's move on. Another question for you though, just because it's always I needed to ask someone it. Do your interactions with the NHS outside of your immediate professional life give you hope, concern, or both?
As always, both really. I'd very rarely say I'd just be on one side of the fence as usual. Sure. I don't really have that much dealings with the NHS outside of what I do for a living, so it's very difficult to say, other than I've got friends who work in different roles within the NHS, so a few A&E docs because of the work I do with the rugby. And I mean, obviously with my young'un, he's under the care of paediatrics at the moment in speech and language.
Sure.
And I've only really got good things to say about the provision once you're in, but it's getting it. That is the difficulty.
Okay.
So it's not a case of you just need to throw money at something, because that is the answer for a lot of people, is just to give the department more money. That's not always the case. It's about having the right amount of people in place to provide the care for the amount of people in that demographic. Mm. So if you had 77,000 MSK patients walking through your door every year, but you only had 2 physios on your department, you'd sharp get a backlog of patients. And it's the same in other services, maybe more so. I think maybe we feel a bit sorry for ourselves in MSK, but we're probably nowhere near the levels that other providers are, like pediatrics, for example.
Yeah, no, I'd certainly agree with that. I think the reason it always gets dragged back to economics is because, staff. The reason that things are poorly staffed is usually because of the funding to not staff them. And so one of the things I'll bring up more with Mark, but it is something that gets complicated, doesn't it? Where can efficiency savings be made?
Well, for me, it needs to be a little bit more outside of just the NHS. So one of the concerns I have is, if someone says to you Newcastle, probably healthy lifestyle isn't going to be on the top of your list of things to associate with Newcastle. Or maybe
only because I know you.
Yeah, a good night out. There's a lot of people who attend A&E because they've had too much to drink. I'm sure it's the same all over the country. One of the biggest things I think is something I picked up on from iFont is the health literacy work that was done. But I can't remember the presenter's name, but she was a Dutch lady, I believe, and was suggesting that the Dutch were leading the way in terms of health literacy across Europe.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big part of it. You hear these stories across social media. And I know that they're the outliers, but you hear these people who ring ambulances because they've been out shopping all day on their feet and now their feet are sore, or they go to A&E because they've got a cold and they can't get a GP appointment that day. So there's a sense of entitlement of, well, I need to see a doctor now, so I'll go to A&E. So it's misuse of services, and we can't throw money at that in the NHS. It has to be a public. The public has to take responsibility for that.
Does need to be sort of a wider societal conversation, doesn't it? Reminds me of the conversation I had with Rachel Moses, which people can find on our Facebook page. We did a Facebook Live from ERWCPT on that very issue. I'm sure it might be something that we double round on and come back to, but I know that certainly with Charlotte and Mark's questions that I've got planned, it will crop up. So before me and you eat too much into other people's material, Rob, I'll bid you farewell and we'll chat again in a bit. Char, as ever, you give us a unique non-MSK angle to these issues as you're at the front line of a paediatric ICU. Can you share any examples of inefficiencies that affect the care that you deliver?
Well, there's inefficiencies everywhere, isn't there? And we've talked a lot already about some inefficiencies that are just across the board, clinicians having to do the work of admin staff, poor technology, all of those kind of things. So I'll start by recapping a couple. Technology is a nightmare. As much as it should be so helpful, we've got some really fantastic pieces of kit that can really, really help us out. But we have a terrible note system, which means inevitably I'm writing at least one set of notes twice a day because it didn't work the first time. So it's all of those little things that just, as much as we can't just say, it's wrong to say that the NHS isn't, just wanting and needing money. It is, definitely. But it's putting it in the right places. It's not buying a computer system that is not quite good enough for what you need. Have the foresight to see what it needs to be able to do, and don't waste your time and waste your money by getting the cheapest one that you think might do. And then things like not having one computer system for the whole of the NHS. Every single pocket of every single community, district, we're in a central hospital that reaches out, as far as the Lake District, as far down as, the Midlands. So have something that can be useful across the board. I think other inefficiencies are less so to do with physio, but more so just to do with the NHS, to do with storing equipment, stocking equipment being able to go out of date, that kind of things. Companies that are able to just, they provide that stuff for us, and there's no justification as to why something can't survive its packet for longer than 2 years, but because it has an out-of-date advert on it, we then can't use it. Other things, infection control issues, the whole, this patient's got an infection, we'll screen them every week, but they'll stay in the cubicle anyway, so we'll keep screening them and keep spending all our money on screening them, but actually it won't necessarily change their care. Or we
so is that because you just go through the motions then? Like, is it just because of policies for policy's sake? It's an inherently a caring thing to do if someone's got an infectious disease, to look after them and stuff, but what you're describing there, if it's not going to affect their care, is someone just in that role for the sake of that being a box ticked? Well, how does that happen?
I would say to some degree it is just a box tick. It's one of those things that because we've started doing it, we can't stop, because ultimately, if you find that you've got a problem with acquisition of diseases, it is absolutely a problem, but the worst thing you can then do as an organisation is stop screening for that infection, because then it kind of admits that you're wrong. And I think that's the difficulty. So I'm not saying that it isn't important, I'm just saying that there's lots of ways that we can look around how we do it and how often we screen and that kind of thing. I know that particularly the intensive care that I'm working on is looking a lot into costs of testing and, things like blood tests and how much they actually need to screen and test people, because we do have patients that are on there for a long time. So they are within themselves looking for better ways of being more efficient. And, in all intents and purposes, it's one of the few places that is a full 7-day service. There isn't very many services that don't happen on there 7 days a week. So I guess that's one of the things that, as much as there are inefficiencies, actually it is quite consistent across the board.
Now, in such a sensitive area of healthcare, conversations about funding become really taboo unless it's simplified to surely we just need more money for poorly children. How much does it cost the taxpayer for time in your ICU, and what medical, social and cultural issues ramp up these costs most and make conversations such as this so sensitive?
So I think if you look at reference costing advice and how to look at chargeable time on an intensive care, I think what they tend to say is your average stay is somewhere around £2,000 a day. And that obviously depends on the level of care that you need, how much input you need, how sick you are, basically. I think there are a lot of issues, and Rob touched on them earlier, to do with society's awareness of the role of NHS. You know, society has a responsibility to remain healthy. They've got to learn to understand health. They've got to learn how to access healthcare. So they've got to not, exactly as Rob said, ring an ambulance because their feet are sore. They've got to think about, actually, there's children here who, without sounding too extreme, could die if they can't get that ambulance in that time frame. And I think that's one of the things where we need to think about that society, that culture, that knowledge of what's out there and what you are, for want of a better word, entitled to as part of the NHS that you pay into. So that's definitely one thing that we need to look at. I think one of the other really difficult things is how the media portrays the NHS, and that is something that I don't know how we can tackle. I don't feel, aside from miracle stories of somebody that survived when they potentially had all odds against them or has been cured from a rare form of cancer, I don't feel that we hear many good stories about the NHS. You don't really hear, oh, the NHS met all of its targets for these. It's always the NHS failed to meet these targets, failed to meet this target, junior doctors, blah, blah, blah. And I really don't know how we get away from that. And particularly now social media is such a thing. All you have to do is one click and you can share any story. And I'm not sure how we tackle that as a population.
Go to the Daily Mail.
Don't read the Mail. I think one of the things as well is even the positive stories, even those miracle stories, they actually feed into it being quite negative in some ways, because they are held up as being, whilst these supposed miracles or these one-off 0.1% chance events can happen, it makes people scramble for that to be them, doesn't it? It almost feeds into this culture of throw anything at it and try anything, and 10th time lucky might be the one. Now in paediatrics that gets particularly messy, doesn't it, especially on ICU. What I'm alluding to is that it gets really sensitive when, if I was to, and I don't like the term, but a term that was bandied around politically for a long time was bed blockers, or even within hospitals it would be mentioned. Now I'm not a fan of the term, but equally I'm not a fan of someone just sort of tears in eyes saying they're not bed blockers, they're human beings. I don't think that's particularly useful either, because essentially what it's alluding to is that if someone is in an ICU bed that shouldn't be for whatever reason, then that is a cost to the taxpayer. So there's somewhere in between demonising and or being overly empathetic in a short-term sense and allowing them to be in a bed that's not necessarily appropriate for their needs at any one time. So is there any way in which, as a society, what difficult conversations do we need to have to try and bridge that gap?
It's definitely a difficult conversation. You know, you're talking about parents making decisions on behalf of their child who's very unwell at that stage and needed intensive care support, and you're asking them to make, you know, sometimes it is binary yes, no decisions. Do you want us to keep treating your child or not? At a time when emotions are all over the place. And, you know, we're very lucky to have very, very good doctors that are able to have those conversations, but still sometimes those conversations aren't enough, and sometimes there's parents, rightly or wrongly, want to continue with care for their child against all odds, and that ultimately becomes the winning decision, regardless of what the medical team say. Sometimes their hands are tied by lack of parental consent, and it's difficult, who does have the right to say what should be provided by the NHS, who can say whether we should treat just life-threatening illnesses or whether we should open that up to life-limiting illnesses as well, who's responsible for all of that. And ultimately the better we get at keeping people alive, to some degree you could argue the worse the state of society is and the more likely it is to need an NHS. And if we're not going to find more money and find more people to staff it, we are ultimately going to have these conversations as well. What does get funded on the NHS? What can we provide them? This person, yes, you can have something, but actually no, this person can't. That's where you then get into the difficulty.
Where the threshold? Do you think making thresholds or limits or guidelines ahead of time would at least assist that conversation and make it what is an incredibly intense, difficult, subjective or somewhat subjective decision with parents make, in a very difficult circumstance? Would having some more objective guidelines in place ahead of time make that more straightforward? I'm not saying that's easy, by the way.
To some degree, but I mean, it's the whole cause health n equals 1. How do you objectify every situation that every person is going to come in on? Sure. And often these situations we're talking about are as rare as it's the only person that's happened to in the country, in the world. It is that rare. So as much as, yes, I actually think a bigger thing is looking at society and the social responsibility of people within society, and that trusting people that have done this for a number of years rather than trusting a friend that shared a Facebook story of something that once didn't happen the way that you think it's happening at the minute, and that kind of thing, rather than always assuming the person that you come into contact with is wrong. Having that ability to question what they're saying to help your understanding rather than because you think they're wrong.
I think there's a wider point in a lot of ways about the faith in experts in current society anyway, isn't there? And many will point fingers.
Tackling that one in an hour.
Many people will point fingers at us as being people that literally question experts for a living now. So are we guilty of colluding with that process?
I think certainly. I mean, a lot's going to change in Manchester, particularly over the next short period of time. There's a lot of changes in the healthcare budget. It is now going to be regionally funded and it's going to be combined with social care. So it will be interesting to see how almost, I guess you could say we're a pilot for a regional healthcare service rather than the traditional national healthcare service, and whether, if it goes well, if it goes badly, that will dictate how the rest of the country has their services funded too. I'm not sure.
Yeah, pivotal time, absolutely. Now that perfectly bridges us into me asking Mark, whilst we this year particularly tried and failed to secure a unit for our bespoke utopian Choose Health headquarters, you ventured back into the NHS as a locum. What did that then teach you?
Oh, hang on. Boo.
Boo the locum. I know, it's terrible, isn't it?
Rob woke back up.
Or is that just me?
That's one of the big expenses in the NHS is Mark's salary.
Locum's pay, yeah. Literally, yeah.
I don't know. That's confusing. I don't yet know if you're doing Mark as a locum or just because it's Mark. It's very
bit of both. A little bit from column A, a little bit from column B.
Bit of both. Well, Mark, if you can remember my question.
Yeah. So being a locum, what have I learned? It's been quite an interesting one because I've had lots of short-term contracts in different places. Some longer than others.
Yeah, tweeting your experiences went well.
Yeah, it really didn't. So you get to see a lot of different trusts and services, and mine have all been around the Northwest. But one of the things I sort of had instant experience with is how much of a postcode lottery it is out there in terms of the quality of the service that you have in your area. Because there's so many different models of service, and some of them are grossly inefficient for all the reasons we talked about already. And some of them work really, really well, but cost a lot of money. So you can go and get a really top quality service just because you're lucky to have been born there. Sure. Or you could be somewhere else, and it could be. I mean, patients probably don't realise, but it's like if you moved sort of 20 miles north, you'd be sorted by now. But instead, you're on a 6-month waiting list.
Right.
And I don't know. I don't know why it's not shared out. So when we talk about the NHS as a whole, the NHS is there's everyone's service is separate, everyone's trust is separate, and everyone sets up their service differently. Now, some services are going to be better than other services. So why aren't the services that are doing really well that are efficient? The trials that Rob spoke about where they've saved money by doing this, and this. Why isn't that shared and rolled out across the board? Why aren't we dragging up the quality of all the services?
We don't blueprint though, do we? It does tend to drag down. But one thing I just wanted to pick up on is it's not just the postcode lottery though, is that you enter a second ballot when you see what physiotherapists you see. It takes a good service to have mitigated that problem.
Oh, well,
and there's very few services I've ever worked in. I mean, unlike Jack and Rob, me and you have worked across a variety of trusts, much because people don't want to keep hold of us. That's one factor. but one thing as well is we've seen firsthand that very few services will actually triage into them, or they will, even if they do, the variety of different things that people would suggest on assessment and treatment of the same human is phenomenal, isn't it?
So that was I mean, from a clinical point of view, that was huge, because as a locum, I'm often coming in to fill gaps. So someone's went off on sick and's not expected back, or somebody's left quite suddenly, and because it's the NHS, it apparently takes 6 months to fill the post. So I'm sort of airdropped in as emergency relief with a full caseload.
Yeah.
So I show up on a Monday morning, first thing, with already a full diary of 13, 15 patients booked in, none of whom I've seen before. I've got half an hour for each one. And I'm looking at it, I'm reading through the notes thinking, this patient's been in treatment for 18 months. They've been mobbed, manipped, and rubbed in places I never even knew there was places. And they're still no better. Why are you still seeing them 18 months later? And I'm going into conversations with these patients, and they're just sort of, there's no long-term plan. And I'm thinking, this has gone on for 18 months. Why isn't there a red flag dinging on someone's doorbell in some form of management going, this patient's been seen 27 times? Why? All it takes is a line manager to knock on the door and say, why have you seen such and such 27 times?
Easy for us to shake his fist upwards, though, isn't it? Like, why is that person? Why have individual physiotherapists who have been with hard-fought autonomy treating that person?
Well, I think that's a historic failing of physiotherapy on the whole, which we've talked about many times, is that although we are supposed to do regular CPD and we're supposed to keep up to date with current evidence, the truth is most don't. And when that HCPC letter comes through, most bang out a diary there and then and draft a bit of evidence together. And in reality, a lot of people are still practicing the way they did 20 years ago, which we now know isn't that efficient. So sure. Why haven't we moved on?
Cross his fingers and hope it comes back around.
Yeah. So, I mean, I know how you police that. I don't really know, because you do take away autonomy if you start removing that from people, and that's something that I'm not really a fan of. But there needs to be some kind of, I think, realization from individual clinicians that the job is not. You can't just go through the motions.
Sure,
You've
I mean
sort
that's
of
one of my favourite disagreements with Jack March is how much authority do we need to bring to that table, when I just would rather it be socially policed, and it'd be just so damn awkward if you were still rubbish. So I just think peer pressure can solve all problems, but which is, I know, ambitious. You know, in these services that you're describing, if one of the solutions, I imagine, so we've spoken about this off air before plenty of times, is that it would be to improve the quality of education and knowledge transfer within these departments. And so naturally you'd find yourself freeing up time. But something I'll happily declare is that working at IPOPs, we have 3 hours a week in which the entire department downs tools. And it's incredibly efficient time, a lot of the time, for service development and the like. But in doing so, that can drive a degree of complacency, some could argue, because within that service, you've probably only got about a third that are regular Physio Matters listeners. So are they getting too much given to them, therefore driving a complacency that makes them less likely to pick up iTunes or find us, when other services that are worked to the bone will be craving that outside of work, and so there's got to be a happy medium, surely.
Yeah, but that's an attitude that needs to be fostered and developed very early. I think keeping people interested can be quite hard. Everyone started their career with an interest in physiotherapy. I think a lot of it peters out when you start. Well, I know that, Jack's example of why he's left the NHS recently. If it becomes a bit of a slog, you start to lose.
Well, you mean the example that he's just given us? The example we know of, or the example that he's just given us on air?
No, the example, the example that he shared with the listeners. If you start to lose that, then people get. It doesn't really matter if you do a good job or a bad job; you still get paid the same. Now that in itself's quite peculiar if you think of traditional work models and performance-related pay. Agenda for Change isn't performance-related pay.
Mm. Well, we could argue that we can be critical of it, but we could argue that model of work is quite good for the tourism in Siberia in the 1970s. But what I want to take you towards is, because I have asked Rob this question, he'd have hung up the phone. But you, on the other hand, like to get into the trenches, of politics. To declare from the off, we're both pulling his hair out at the moment as the Labour Party going off the ideological deep end. And so, if I ask you, what is the middle ground policy between it's broken and simply needs free market economics to fix it, and it simply needs more money, leave it alone, that we could possibly get behind? Where is that sweet spot? Because it's fair for me to say, I hope that neither of us we're fan of neither of those positions.
No, I think both of them would probably fix it and simultaneously make it a lot worse if you did either of those things. And what we've seen is that a lot of sort of short-term solutions to the NHS. So every election cycle, someone has a policy, and they inevitably enact that policy, but it's never what they actually said they were going to do. I think getting money to the right areas would be a start. Pumping money in blindly is just silly. But we've seen, huge cuts in social care, huge cuts to local council budgets, which massively affect community care. And then we get really confused when acute hospitals start to become overrun with patients seeking, because they can't get GP's appointments, seeking A&E. They can't get, there's no one to nurse them in the community. There's no care assistants in the community, or not enough. So because the funding's been cut, and therefore we have bed blockers because there's no one to discharge them to.
They're human beings.
They are. I mean, bed blockers is a strange term because it puts the onus on the person. It makes the person sound like they're they're actually blocking it, when in reality it's the system's just obviously failed.
Sure.
But I don't think people seem to realise that the NHS, how much money the NHS needs to spend, comes a lot from other areas as well. So if you start cutting social care, the NHS is going to have to spend more money.
Sure.
So they'll say, oh, well, we'll protect the NHS budget by reducing our cost on social care, but then not understanding the fact that what's going to happen there.
Well, it's quite embarrassing when we just watch that happen. Like, we completely can anticipate that. That's not a mystery. That happens every time it's been tried, and so it is sort of painful to watch. I want to bring you back to how what I used as a lead into this question was: isn't it bizarre that we're not got a system that can reward good practice and punish poor practice? Now, that system is such that everyone, and we know that pay structures similarly, it is just that all for one and one for all, everyone's well-meaning, everyone's in caring professions, and therefore everyone's going to do their best and do their bit. That naive then?
Yes. I'll just say yes. It's quite, I mean, you can hope, but you can't always rely on human beings to just do the right thing all the time. I think there needs to be some sense of control over it. What I think Agenda for Change was meant to sort of alter that. Agenda for Change was seen as a fair way of making sure that people are paid fairly for their knowledge and experience. And what we've seen is that Agenda for Change has become people being paid for the amount of years and experience.
Or being re-interviewed for the same job at a lower band.
In what, sorry?
Being re-interviewed for the same job at a lower band.
Well, recently, there's a lot of debanding happened.
But because we've got that Agenda for Change label.
Yeah.
In the banding system.
I think the banding system, we've seen a lot of jobs rebanded to do the same job at a lower pay, at a lower banding, which is just peculiar, and how anybody really stood for it, I don't really know. But what I mean is people sort of progress through Agenda for Change. So you qualify, you start as band 5. You then get your increments every 12 months. Now, that's meant to be performance related, but has anyone ever heard of someone not getting their increment? That's what I'd like to know, because I've not. So every 12 months you get your increment. Then after X number of years, you can apply for band 6 roles. And after X number of years as a band 6, you can apply for band 7 roles. And really, knowledge and experience doesn't work in years practice. But that seems to be the way that Agenda for Change has utilised its system. And then, you get the bad effects of Agenda for Change, where they just deband stuff sporadically because they want to save money.
Yeah. No, I mean,
do you think we need to have some more regular testing then? The docs have regular examinations and having to make sure that you're up to scratch.
Can we trust? That brings in the question: Can we who are we trusting to regulate these tests? Or are institutions up to scratch to make that a useful threshold? Like what? I don't know if I'd pass, but I know that's not a great measure.
No, I probably wouldn't leave it up to you. No. But it's a difficult one because CSP would be the number one, but it's a trade union, so you pay money to be a member of the CSP. So the CSP is in an impossible situation to regulate its members. Because it can't really, because you're paying to be part of it. They're not going to kick you out as a member because you're not good enough. That's just silly. Then it won't get you money. And it also couldn't function properly as a trade union. The HCPC would be, I mean, I suppose they're the ones that should. So they're the ones that should force that quality, if you like. And every 2 years, they look at 2.5% of the profession every 2 years. So I calculate, because I got regulated, I passed first time. I don't know if you did, Jack. Did you pass first time? Did you
I'm glad you brought that up, mate. I managed to squeeze it through on second time of asking. I think I have managed to keep that from the listeners, actually. But yeah, I mean, but we've got it. I hope that as much as my incompetence is laughable, it is fun for me to have been called up and having failed a CPD audit when I've been shown full portfolios where people have used only the work that we've put online for that portfolio, and they've passed it. So I don't know how I managed that.
Yeah, and this is it. Just so the HCPC every 2 years will pick 2.5%. So they've picked 2.5%. They've got me and you. I've passed, you haven't. How they've come to that, I don't really know. I'd love to see the workings of that, but
considering he copied your portfolio,
considering I sent him mine on the demo. So but that's weird. But then if you take the stats, 2.5% every 2 years, you can go through a 40-year career, and chances are you're not going to be called. There's a more than 50% chance that you won't be called across however many years in your career. Now that's just crazy. Because you can't get through. Most physios will never be called in their career. That's just stupid. I just don't see how that at all can regulate quality of any clinician.
Well, the only
so
way
I'd say
that,
the HCPC is inept at doing that.
I'd agree with that. But the only, when I've thought about this long and hard, particularly in and around the Karen Middleton podcast, that was still this year's worth, wasn't it? So we can reflect on that. It's not, but what I thought about was that the only time really that you encounter something that is a leveler of your ability is when you sit in front of a job interview. And that's the only real time where you're actually passing any through any thresholds, because you're right, no one's withdrawn. And I think in a lot of ways, considering the system on the whole, I think it would be introducing managerial dictators if you had someone that had the capacity to thwart your moving through a gateway and getting your band increment, considering that the amount of doesn't move even with inflation, does it? So it's like that would be really messy if you had who's relating it to performance based on what data that you haven't got time to collect in your role because you're being flogged, and then your manager who's decided to go non-clinical into management after 5 years of average practice is judging your ability as a physio. Good luck with that.
Yeah,
tricky.
But it comes back. So we mentioned this with the trusts, and Rob's mentioned it. Sort of, there's loads and loads of data on how efficient trusts are. Loads of outcome data. It's just not used. I'm pretty sure it'll be the same with clinicians. If you just took some basic measures, so number of sessions to discharge, and just look for trends. Who's seeing people lots of times, who's not? What's the difference there? Who can learn from who? Can we get you to be more like them? What's the difference? Just
do we do that?
Basic.
Can I say that as another pro?
Another pro. I don't think that's specific to private practice. I don't think that has to be private companies that do that. NHS can do that. It just doesn't. So when we see that private companies can come in and do it better, and they can. But there's absolutely no reason why the NHS service couldn't have done that in the first place. So I just think we need to wise up. It comes back to what you've said about complacency, Jack. People don't have to sing for the supper. We work in community MSK departments. They're commissioned. Every time commissioning comes around, they're recommissioned. It's only very, very recently that the physio departments have had to go, oh yeah, we might need to prove how effective we are, because companies like Connect Health are coming in and bidding for the contract now. And actually, we need to prove that what we're doing is a good job. Well, why weren't we proving that anyway? Why didn't we have data on that?
Why wasn't it answerable? Yeah, I mean, but remember, Mark, that using data and evidence is simply part of a neoliberal agenda to beat workers with.
Of course, well, it'll never get us elected anyway. Using evidence and common sense, it's not a very electable policy, to be honest.
No, I know it's very tricky, but. I wonder
Sorry,
if we'd get that from Rob. But as I alluded to, I was surprised he's still on the line, but he was probably on the line just to make the snoring noises when we got carried away.
Looking for an opportunity.
And Jim, because you've not been in for a while, are you still on the line?
I'm still here.
There he is. And what's your thoughts then on? So we've gone full circle, really. You mentioned about the fact that you've left the NHS, and there's various reasons, both professional and personal. But on a couple of occasions, complacency's come up, and Mark's just shone a light on the notion that if you can't reward the good, and although I don't like the word punish the bad, you also heard me and Rachel Moses talk about this quite controversially at ERWCPT. Getting a cutthroat gestures from the CSP as we're sat on their stand talking about we need to come down harder on people. So what's your take on that, considering your own personal experiences recently?
I get stuck. So you mentioned that we slightly disagree that on how people should be called out on their practice. So you think peer pressure is the way forwards, and my counter to that is, well, who's providing the peer pressure? Because these
Can't see it anyway. Yeah.
No,
it's systemic, it's cultural.
Yeah. So if you then if you look at the school system, for example, you have this Ofsted scenario coming in where they externally look at things. Now, okay, we've got we've got the CQC, but I don't see the same reporting, the same concern when they come in and do things. So like Shah said about the media almost solely gives a negative view of the NHS. So if you get a bad report from the CQC, it's almost like, it's the NHS, isn't it? Whereas where are the good ones coming from IPOPs? Where are the good ones coming from the good services? Why are they not getting a grading, let's say, even if you made it as simple as that? Why not have, I can't remember what the school one is, what is it, excellent or outstanding?
Good.
You don't get many people raving about Ofsted, though, do you, that's in education? I mean, it's like
no,
that's another.
A lot of parents do, though.
But
Jack.
you can't deny
parents
externally
choose schools based on Ofsted outcomes.
Yeah, so externally it works like a charm. So you get people moving to catchment areas because that school's outstanding. Imagine if you had a similar system for hospitals. People moved because that hospital got outstanding, so they want their house price goes up because that hospital's better. Would that not push the hospitals to strive further? I don't know. It's a different.
I think that's
different
coming. I do think that's coming.
You think that's coming?
Yeah. Particularly
I'm ahead of my time.
But like everything is just so at the click of, one button. You can find out so much information.
Let me propose a policy for our future manifesto then. And do you know we could have a system? Could we have a system of future secret shoppers? Would that be an appropriate way of doing it? So if you had well qualified, say that again, sorry.
I'd apply for that job.
We'd have a relatively well qualified, or I'd always sooner a democratically elected group of people with some expertise that would go in as, say, we went in as a team of MSK secret shoppers in a region. I mean, we're thinking about potentially even throwing this out there. I mean, me and Mark talked about putting this out there as a Choose Health service, even for any brave companies that wanted to invite us in. We'd need chin putty and sort of fake noses and that, but because of our
you'd have
huge
accredited knees. You're about 8 feet tall.
And that, yeah. But generally speaking, we'll try and put his costumes on and potentially have a secret shopping service. How about that? Any opposition to that?
Pretend to have a problem and waste an appointment time.
Yeah, I would have a massive issue with that as well, Charlotte. Just being a huge waste of clinician time while someone tries to pretend to treat a pretend knee injury. That I
don't need to pretend to have injuries. That is not a worry.
When you made a chocolate, you're all right. Yeah. Well, you've been a secret shopper this year, haven't you? You've went and tried it as a patient. How was it for you?
Well, yeah, I'm going to tell that story in full actually, and I wouldn't do it justice in a couple of minutes. I'm thinking when I get back to where I want to be, I'm going to get
myself interviewed, probably by Paula, because she had a look at me as a colleague. She looked at me physio wise and redid my neuro every few days when I got foot drops. So it is worth probably. I'll get her to interview me in a few months' time when I get back on my board and stuff like that. So I didn't want to count my chickens and get interviewed too far ahead of time. So it's a good question. In brief, it's unfortunately just confirmed a lot of the things we bitch and moan about. There was quite a lot of disparity between the messages being given, a lot of myths being perpetuated. One of the classic, just to give you a taster, you guys and I think you guys might have heard it, but the listeners a taster, is that we always thought that spines being described as or discs being described as jam donuts was the sort of benchmark of the worst thing to say to people. But actually, it was described as, no, it's like a jam donut, but it's not quite that, because the jam will always come out in the way that it came in. It's more like a series of vanilla slices, where the custard will come out the back and the sides. Now, can you think of a daintier pastry than a vanilla slice? So,
is that why you're so fragile now?
Well, clearly,
or
yeah.
I mean, before?
no matter how many times I've read Explain Pain weekly since, and it just can't wash it off. It's like a stench that can't be washed. So yeah, I've been broken since then. That's how words work, isn't it? As soon as they're uttered, no matter what else I've come to understand about the world around me, I'm fragile, I'm broken, I'm vulnerable. So yeah, sensitized I am. So I will tell my story in full. I have been a bit of a secret shopper, although of course I declared that I was a physio whenever asked, so it wasn't much of a secret. But despite regularly reminding any professional I was in front of that I was a physio, that didn't really stop them perpetuating some of the biggest nonsense I've ever heard, and it was quite frustrating because that nonsense was informing their reasoning and at times informing my care, and I had to push quite hard and was very fortunate to be supposedly at least in the know, and I'm glad I could be an advocate for myself, because it does give me a lot of cause for concern, which is one of the reasons that we thought this episode would be relevant. We've touched on pros, we've touched on cons. Sounds like we've all got an awful lot of hope, but also we're not shy to shed light on the concerns that we have. It is simpler than it just needs more money, but also it's not something that just needs scrapping and restarting, and we can't press the reset button. That's not an option.
It's the best of its kind. However broken it is, it's the best of its kind.
That needs to be remembered, doesn't it? The fact that statistically, if we look at the empirical data, it tends to outperform anything like itself, doesn't it, across the world?
But then you can't say it's the most efficient service in the world, therefore it can't be more efficient, because that's also demonstrably wrong, like we've just talked about.
And I don't think it is. That's one of the things as well, is that there is a bit of a false equivalence, isn't it? Is that it's compared to systems that aren't as integrated as it, and so it can be something that the statistical data can be doctored to make it look better sometimes. Unfortunately, when I've scratched beneath the surface, it is very good. It's also one of the oldest and one of the most complex, most intertwined. But it can be a big bureaucratic entity, can't it? It can be a large thing that's very unadaptable at times.
Yeah,
that's a worry.
Change takes it so long. That's probably the biggest frustration.
It's hard to turn a massive ship around. One of the things that was just worth maybe closing on, I just get any final comments from you guys, is that one of the things that most people in a very with a sensible pro NHS agenda would be quite frustrated by large corporations that would allow for sort of a cronyist agenda to be using the NHS to extract money from it, yet seem far less concerned about just how large and monolithic the NHS is in itself. It's like I get concerned when people say it's okay when my guy does it. And so essentially I feel the NHS makes some of the mistakes that big business make on a regular basis, over bureaucratic, lots of layers of management, doing inefficient things and not respecting the work of the interface clinician in front of the patient. I've said a lot there. Anyone want to pass comment on it or disagree?
I don't think I know any organisation, but that's because I don't really work in any other field, that has such a publicly polarised view. So you got one side of the fence saying hands off my NHS, the other side that are the NHS is broken. I mean, you couldn't get further polarised arguments from each other when it comes to the NHS, could you?
No.
That's 2016 in a nutshell, though, isn't it?
Well,
It seems like
polarisation.
everything's either completely broke or leave it alone, or completely wrong, or perfectly fine.
You're living in the past, man. It's 2017. Get over yourself.
Oh my days! I've not been at work yet. I've not had to write that number on patient notes yet, so I'm still living in the past.
He's still hungover, lads. We'll give him some space.
Still playing on a Super Nintendo.
So great, gives me great pleasure to introduce to you all a long friend of mine. That makes no sense. Old friend of mine, Felicity Thow, who's kindly joined the team to whip us into shape. One of the most organised people I know. Happily for us, she's back in the country, so she's going to lend a hand whipping us and the Physio Matters team into shape. And she's also got some really unique insights, and we like interesting people, so here's another one for you. I don't need you to introduce yourself, Flick. I'll try and do some of that on the intro and outro and stuff, but just to delve straight into what we're talking about today, which is the NHS. You're back from a few years in New Zealand, having worked in the NHS across a variety of services back before you then moved to New Zealand, and then you've come back into the private sector for MSK work, so quite varied roles that you've had. Any lessons for us from down under, and what does the NHS do better than other things that you've experienced?
Sure. Well, I suppose the first thing to go over is how the New Zealand system works. So they have their public system, waiting lists and all. They have their private sector as well, but the difference is they also have a state-run insurance scheme, ACC. So if you have an accident in New Zealand, you are eligible for subsidised physio, subsidised imaging, subsidised GP appointments related to that accident. So I think that's the difference with private practice in New Zealand, is that while it's private, it's also heavily subsidised. So you'd be paying around $20 or £10 for your 30-minute session.
Right. Okay.
And people, that used to be free. That used to be totally subsidised by the state, but now it used to be totally paid for by the state. Now it's only partly subsidised, and people pay it, and people use that more than they would pay for more than they'd use the public system. So I think what I learned in New Zealand is that people are willing to pay some amount for this service.
Did that surprise you initially?
It did. I remember having a conversation with one of my seniors and saying, I feel really weird charging people coming from the NHS. Feel really weird charging people for this, for physio. And she said to us, yeah, but like, what do you pay to get your hair done or your car fixed? So I thought, gosh, yeah, I've never really thought about it like that. I think
it's just your habit of probably just not quite recognising your own self-worth and your expertise at that point, just sort of like going into it and just thinking like, it feels
totally alien.
Yeah,
totally alien that you'd have a treatment session and come out to a bill, but having worked in the NHS, but yes, no, people do pay for valued service, as you say, and it's
it's like their health's important to them or something. It's quite bizarre.
Yeah. No, I do find it interesting that we do pay extortionate amounts of money for people to paint my toenails, but you think, oh gosh, I charge people for their physio carers.
And we feel guilty.
It's different, I'm gonna
true.
charge people for their prescriptions. Heaven forbid.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the difference in the systems then. So
yeah,
I mean, it's almost quite polite and correct for us to talk about differences and not say about what's better, what's worse. So let's delve into it. So were there any? Because probably worth inviting the guests to know that you took
your body and your diabetes to New Zealand.
Yeah.
So your understanding of it isn't just a professional one. You'll have had a personal relationship with their system and ours. So
That's right.
I don't mind if you want to talk about some of the professional or personal differences. But what did you notice?
Well, they were. If you're not a resident of New Zealand, you pay much more for your prescriptions and your healthcare than if you are a resident, naturally. So to see a diabetes consultant, for instance, as a non-resident will cost you equivalent of about £150, £200
Right.
every 6 months or every year. When you are a resident, you're in the public system for that, so that's free, but you still pay for your prescriptions. So whereas under the NHS, I get all of my prescriptions free, insulin and anything else that I might be prescribed ever, that's free. Yeah. In New Zealand, it's $5 per item, so £2.50 per item. And I've never minded paying for the prescriptions either. I've often thought in the NHS, well, great that I can get my insulin free and also vital, but if I had needed some antibiotics or something like that, I'd be happy to pay my £7.50 for that.
It does seem unusual. I mean, it's nice to hear you say that, because it's things that I think about and feel guilty as soon as I do, because you feel like you're in a position of privilege, talking about something that you can only understand secondhand. So it's I do agree. Did I ever tell you about the story where a patient of mine saw off a load of Lucozade before a fasting bloods because he'd been borderline for several years, and his mate he found out that his mate had been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes and was getting his prescriptions for free, and so he's just like, what's this about? So he saw some Lucozade, got the badge of honour, and then was quite proud to tell me about it. Right. Not a good. I mean, it's not good, is it? But and I know a small anecdote. But so that's a different. So when you were over there, I mean that's. Yeah. I mean, we're 5 minutes in and you've walked into some controversy already. So as a non-resident, did you feel aggrieved to be treated differently?
I remember being really, really annoyed that I was having to spend $300 on a consultant appointment that was, a routine. That I didn't get any big information in this appointment. It was, the usual foot check.
You got your foot tickled, did you?
Looked at,
yeah. Okay, cool.
But at the same time, I could understand it. I'd been in the country for 2 months and hadn't contributed to their healthcare system at that point. So I could understand it. And then when I got my prescriptions funded as well, $5, and I do think maybe if you've got multiple people in your family with ongoing health conditions and a lower income, then I can imagine things might be tight. Even $5 per that's per each type of insulin that you use, and you'll use 2, and your needles and your test strips and your finger prickers.
Right.
Yeah.
Would you therefore, when you play that back, do you think that would be an appropriate thing for us to implement in the UK?
I do. And if not the insulin, the basics of it, maybe the extras, and then you think, well, where does it end? Because as a diabetic, you're prone to infection, so maybe you're going to use antibiotics more than other people. But yeah, no, I used to know a girl who worked with NHS prescriptions, and she used to say that the vast majority, I can't remember the exact percentage, the vast majority of NHS prescriptions aren't actually paid for by the person using them. Yeah, which is mind blowing. I think the
stat is that a huge chunk, I think it's at least an annual deficit, perhaps. I should fact check this before we publish it, but I think it's if they charge 50 pence for every prescription that's usually given away free, I think it's the annual deficit for medications that the NHS struggles with would be plugged. Yeah. I think it's something, there's quite a large amount aren't paid for. It's quite rare to be paying. So yeah, how about then the other side of what you've been saying then? Do you think it would be a fair application of a New Zealand system for non-residents to be paying a different sort of two-tiered system? Because they're obviously super controversial.
Very much so, isn't it? that is hard. And how do you implement it as well?
Well, how do they implement it with you?
With you? Yes, you put your prescription in. They say you've not got a
visa.
Probably it's like a state security number. Exactly. Yeah. What is your residency status? And if you haven't got a visa, you haven't got
I'll tell you what. I mean, I'm laughing at how savage my question is. This is your warm up. Welcome to Physio Matters, and I'm asking you about your immigration policies. So I'm gonna let you wriggle away from that, because even I feel nasty. But we'll possibly revisit it when I get heckled for even asking the question. I think we should charge an immigrant diabetics extortionate amounts for the things that they need to survive their insulin? No. do I think if you're going to see a diabetes consultant, it's fair to charge more, like I was in New Zealand? Yeah, probably. Yeah. Yeah, fair enough. You've gone there. Lovely. No, that makes sense. Now, what's the with the NHS as you knew it when you left, and then to go over to New Zealand, what was its perception? What was its understanding amongst your fellow expats, and the public perception by Kiwis? What's the sort of situation?
I do recall it being sometimes negative, and I suppose that's because when you live in New Zealand, you don't have any direct contact with the NHS. You don't get any good stories. You just get BBC News telling you all the bad stuff. So it does reinforce quite a lot of negative beliefs while you're out there. And I used to get patients kind of saying, I'm pleased I'm not dealing with the NHS. But whereas if you have an accident, yes, your care is subsidised. But if you don't, if you need a hip replacement because of OA, you're paying for that, or your health insurance is, but either way you're forking that out. Mm-hmm. Or you're paying to have your cardiac valve operation.
Sure. Charlotte was mentioning about the media's portrayal of the NHS being part of her frustrations earlier on. And so it totally makes sense. What about then? Yeah. What about any disparity between how it was perceived when you were out there and since you've come back? Because we've spoken briefly off air about the fact that there's a bit of a cloud over the NHS right now.
Yeah. But then again, I do think there's this, having been back, I do think there's a surge of backing for the NHS. Mm-hmm. I see Twitter accounts and people, really kind of appreciating it. So I see more positivity here than I did from afar. But I certainly can see the concerns.
No, fair play. No, that's cool. You came back into private sector MSK work in this country, and so there's talking of any disparities between the way that things are perceived. How do you feel the NHS and the private sector in the UK look at each other, and do the stereotypes play out fairly?
I think I would never. I get really offended by NHS bashers within the private sector because I worked in the NHS and I'm the same physio, or more experienced physio, but same person that I treat people the same either.
Yeah, you're just as bad now as you were then.
Thanks. Yeah. So yeah, no. Try to think about how to.
It works both ways, though. It does play both ways. I mean, when you were working in the NHS, sometimes the thought of a patient defecting to the private sector was more fool them, wasn't it? I mean, I constantly have it both ways.
Yeah. The biggest thing is the waiting list. That's the biggest comment I get, and I treat people who are on the NHS waiting list, and I treat members of staff who can't even get in to be seen, and it's all about the waiting list. That just seems to be the major pitfall, and I think I'm okay with an element of privatisation. It's the word that everyone hates, isn't it? But you know, what would
You'll
the waiting list be
you'll
like?
be tickled when you listen to the rest of this podcast.
Oh, really?
Yeah, we say that like it becomes a dirty word. We chat about that with Rob quite a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think if you're providing a service, and what would the waiting list be like if we didn't have these private services?
Yeah, no, that's
huge.
True. That's true. It makes sense. It's a delicate one, and we're certainly not going to be able to put that to right. But yeah, we'll probably reconvene over this conversation. It seems with everyone that we've chatted to, all the team have got more to say on these, so we'll revisit, I'm sure. But which, if any, of the places that you've worked are most understanding and accepting of new ideas, such as the ones we espouse on Physio Matters? Because I know you've been a regular listener from afar, haven't you?
Yeah. I actually think probably my rotational post as a in the NHS, a band 5 physio. I feel like when I left the NHS, things were just starting to become a bit more. People were becoming a bit more nervous about the any willing provider scheme had just kind of started to be a spec. So we were having training on the outcome measure tools and things, and the message was, we need to do these outcome measures and we need to be good because there's competition, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. This is, that's bring it on almost. Sure. But we need to be good at this, and I think there was much more impetus within the NHS to be good, because that was the outcome. If we can't prove that we're good or effective, then we're not going to get this funding.
So the concept of it actually did produce the positive upward trend that they were planning at that point in time.
I think so.
Yeah.
I feel like if new ideas came out within my in-service training sessions in the NHS, generations of physios would be interested in that, and it's less what I'm seeing in private.
Right. So that's that's a really nice positive to play on the NHS there. Then that you feel they are actually more adaptable, more open to ideas that sometimes will go against their biases, their better judgment of years gone by. There were older members of staff, more qualified members of staff that were more open to those things than perhaps sometimes we see in private practice, and I'll admit certainly within the sporting sector of private practice that's sometimes the most complex, the stickiest place to change things, because the theatre is the dial is turned up to 10 on the theatre aspect of things, and the egocentrism that can exist in those sectors. So that's promising to hear, because I think with your band 5, you talked there about when I was on my band 5 rotational post. I mean, they're like unicorn crap, aren't they? It's like where they are now found, and where the rotations are well supported, and where the training is of a good standard, like you had. I mean, you had a great apprenticeship, as we could call it, didn't you, down in Birmingham? So someone might argue with us that what you've just described there would be idyllic, but how likely it is these days, although it's not that many years ago, make you sound ancient, don't I, by saying that? But but yeah, no, maybe that's something that we're wishing for, something that can't exist anymore. But it's promising that when it's done well, then you've got a versatile workforce that are open to new ideas, because we feel like sometimes we're either preaching to the converted on Physio Matters, or that when it gets under the noses of people that oppose some of the notions and ideas that come from the experts, they are so resistant that it just doesn't get implemented, and perhaps that's because the people that it's just making a few pennies drop, maybe they don't get in touch with us as much, so perhaps that's playing out. So is there with regards to now being home, and being someone who has a professional and personal relationship with the NHS on a regular basis, more than most of us, does it give you a sense of pride in the NHS? Does it make you quite patriotic about our health system, or is it something that makes you grit your teeth and just cross your fingers that it doesn't go into any downward spiral?
a bit of both, really. Definitely a sense of pride, and also a sense of a real sense of gratitude, especially with diabetes. I think if you try and take your long-term health condition overseas, it is eye-opening. You see what, I've spent some time in the States over the summer. I don't know how people fund something like diabetes when you're paying for your healthcare, and it's not going anywhere anytime soon. So if you can, financially, if you can be helped with a long-term health condition, there's going to be long-term benefits in that for the health system anyway. So I hope
something that Mark and Charlotte brought up in different points really was the sense of individual responsibility and the social and cultural responsibility we can all assume to live better. Now, I think it might even have been Rob joining in on that said about Mark had said we have a responsibility to keep well and live well and stuff, and that responsibility, whilst that's something that almost feels a moral and ethical one, isn't a responsibility that's upheld, and there's no real burning consequences but for ill health, because there's such a significant safety net. So your take on that? I mean, there's always a bit of both. We need a safety net, both economically we need a safety net, and in healthcare we certainly do, and we do have that in the UK. People always argue it should be bigger in different political leanings, but in your take on the matter, are you it's going to lump you in now, but let's just, for the sake of pressing fast forward on a question, but like, are you and your fellow diabetics in general doing everything you can for as individuals to best support a system, or is it lent on too heavily?
Oh, that's a question. And I can only speak for myself as a type 1 diabetic as well. Mm-hmm. And there's a huge difference between the type 1 and the type 2 disease. Disease word, but as a population, I think all you can do is educate people, can't you? All you can do is tell them the consequences of, and the consequences of type 1 diabetes is the same as the consequences of type 2. The onset is different, the treatment is different, but having high blood sugars consistently leads to the same outcomes, really. Mm-hmm. And so I think, I was sat down by a diabetic nurse on day 1, and she told me about strokes and neuropathies and retinopathies and all sorts. And I think if you like, what else can she do? What else can you do? I don't know.
I'm with you. It's just that the argument of what else could you do? I mean, it wouldn't necessarily be my policy, but it's that those are just words. The consequential actions is that there is still when those events happen, despite education and poor adherence with said education over a long period of time, the kitchen sink is still thrown at us as individuals when it hits the fan. And like I say, I don't know where I would be on drawing lines there, but I just don't. My fear, having had this conversation and many like it, my fear is that it's just not sustainable for us for people to just know that they're dealing themselves a bad hand, swing the odds strongly against their favour over a long period of time, counter to advice, despite having been educated on it in an age of information. They're not ignorant. They're just crossing their fingers and chancing their arm. But then for the consequences to be significant, and I'm not underestimating just how disabling these things can be, the fact that then there is a weight of they cash in all their chips and they cross their fingers that the NHS can support them no matter what. That's where what else can you do? I'm not saying it's easy, but that's the what else you can do, isn't it? Is that there becomes significant consequences because there's red lines that people cross, and we do have it in certain circumstances. We know that when it comes to transplantation and things, there are thresholds and there are things that boxes you've got to tick, and you've got to show that you're worth the investment. But it's not necessarily taken down to your diabetes and your COPDs and things like that yet, is it? But maybe that's something in the future that we need to have open, honest discussion about.
Yeah. I've certainly worked with type 2 diabetics and amputee setting, and prosthesis. There's a huge cost involved. You used to talk to the physios who were specialists there, and they'd say if you can at all tell people about how hard it is to walk with this prosthesis, especially when you've come from a type 2 diabetic lifestyle that's led to an amputation. You tend not to be the most conditioned person in the world. Sure. But there was an element of, okay, so I've had my leg amputated, right? Where prosthesis? When am I walking again? They found that there was lots of DNAs between that. You get your prosthesis, you realise how heavy and difficult it is. You're not given a Blade Runner leg, under the NHS as a having come from the elderly rehab board, and then they don't come back, and you've got this prosthesis now lying around, not being used, not being rehabbed on. And I totally see your point. It's a huge issue, and it's not just among diabetics in the news, isn't it? It's about obesity and overweightness in general.
Absolutely. No, I know, and it's a complex one and something we can't put to right now. But getting those cogs turning is all we can do on the podcast, and probably these discussions will delve straight onto social media, where I know you're getting involved with the team. So I again thank you for joining the crew. I'm really looking forward to working with you once more. And thanks for this chat. It's been really enlightening. I'm sure the listeners will really appreciate your thoughts and might even be picking your brain further into the year.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Nice one. Cheers, Flick.
Anything else that anyone wants to add? Otherwise, I will wrap it up. I'm going to try, if we can. We've not planned an order, but we'll try and do our usual cheesy sign out. I'll go first, then Charlotte, and if we do it right, then we can finish. Let's go me, Charlotte, Rob, Mark, Jack, and just leave him. Actually, Jack going last isn't a good idea because he actually doesn't understand how the delays work and stuff in the sign out. He's not very good at it. But we'll give it twice. We'll see if we can do it.
Because he's from Norfolk, there's a satellite delay. Is that what you're saying?
There's no cure for stupid, mate.
He's in his local library. Shaw's going to go last. Okay, we can't be trusted. I've changed his mind. It'll go me, Jack, Mark, Rob, Charlotte. You've been listening to the Physio Matters podcast.
Discussing physio matters.
Because physio?
Matters. So I thought I could say a lot and then Jack wouldn't think to say. See, I still think Jack managed to ruin that. I thought I'd at least give a sentence.
I have no idea how.
I wasn't going to say. Well, it'd be weird if I said. Okay, let's try again. You've been listening.
What's the order?
Okay, you've been listening to
the Physio Matters podcast.
Discussing physio matters.
Because
physio matters.
Ta-da!
That's terrible.
Oh, wow.
Couldn't have gone better.
That couldn't have gone worse. But anyway, happy New Year to you all, you filthy animals.
And to you.
Can you tell we watched 2 Million earlier?